Well, good evening. Welcome to the first session in a series on the book of Hosea. We finished with Zephaniah last week, and so now we are moving on to Hosea. This evening we'll look at the first chapter, but maybe what I'll start with is a little bit of a sort of an introduction to the structure of the Tanakh, to the structure of what many Christians call the Old Testament, but we call the Tanakh. It's simply an acronym that makes up the sections of the book of the Bible that actually Jesus would have read. So T is a Torah, commonly called the law. Maybe more favorably thought of as the teaching. So that's Genesis, the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then the next section in the Tanakh is the Nevi'im, the prophets. And instead of starting with Isaiah, as you would think when I say the prophets, it starts with Joshua, and it runs through Joshua, Samuel, Kings, and then to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and finally to this thing called the Book of the 12, of which Hosea is the first. So Hosea is the head of the middle section of the Hebrew Bible, and then that section is followed by a section called the Ketuvim, or the writings, which includes the Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ruth, Daniel, Esther, Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And this is the structure of the Bible that Jesus refers to on the Emmaus Road at the end of the Gospel of Luke, when he's walking along and he teaches his disciples from this formula called the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, and the writings. And in a way, it makes a great deal of sense, because Torah gives you the law, and then the prophets are all about applying the law to the people. They're more like the lawyers, the Jewish lawyers, applying the law to the people. And then the writings are the books that help us to live out the law. So you've got the sort of the basics of the law in the Torah, and you've got the prophets applying the law, and then the writings teaching us how to live the law out in our own lives. And as I said, Hosea is the head of the book of something called the Book of the 12, which has been a complete unit for quite some time. And much work has been done recently on the idea of the Book of the 12 as having a structure. There is a man called Paul House. He's perhaps the best known person for giving us this structure. The prophets, the minor prophets as they're called, or the Book of the 12, has this constant circular theme of sin, punishment, and restoration, or sin, judgment, and restoration. There are repeated themes of prophecy in general, but particularly in the Book of the 12. And it's helpful, I think, to think of it like, I don't know if you've ever seen Handel's Messiah, or maybe if you take really any great symphony, there are themes that will be recycled, movements of music that will be recycled, patterns that are repeated again and again, that reinforce the identity of the unit that you're listening to and its message. So the first 6 books of the 12 are really about the hopelessness of sin being exposed, the hopelessness of sin being exposed. Sin is described as covenantal and cosmic. So it's covenantal with the people, but it's also cosmic in its scale. And then Nahum and Habakkuk and Zephaniah, well, as we know from working through Zephaniah dealt with punishment and discipline in quite some detail. It's a love-driven, father-like discipline, but nonetheless, those are the dominant themes in Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. And then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, Well, they were about restoration. And again, I think if you just think back over the last few months as we've been with each other, think how there was a sort of a very different vibe, wasn't there, to Zechariah as we worked through it, as compared to Zephaniah, which though had a lot of beautiful, encouraging, lovely material, sometimes was really quite challenging. So, what of the book of Hosea? I'll say a little bit about the timing of it when I get to the actual text. Hosea is a very unique piece of work. Its focus is almost exclusively, and perhaps exclusively, really on Israel. And when I say Israel, I'm not talking about northern. I'm talking about the covenant people of God, if you like. It's not cosmic or global in its scale. It's very personal. It's very intimate, and it is perhaps, and if this isn't too heretical to say, it's perhaps where we see God at his most irrationally gracious. It's God at his most irrationally gracious. Some of you would have known Leonard Nimoy as Spock in Star Trek, and that was always Leonard Nimoy. That was always Spock's problem, wasn't it? He couldn't understand why humans were so irrational. And in the book of Hosea, we see God explaining why he judges, but never explaining why he forgives. He's just driven by this incredible love for the people that he has chosen. And we'll spend the next 3 weeks in the first 3 chapters, I imagine. And those 3 chapters actually could fit on the front of any of the following books as an introduction, because we will see that this pattern of Israel disregarding their covenant responsibilities, Yahweh getting angry about their behavior, and yet Yahweh's refusing to cast off his rebellious child, and then working salvation through his discipline. You'll see those patterns just happen again and again and again. And in Hosea, in a way, it's so clear. We start with this picture of marriage, and then is marriage, adultery, and restoration. And you'll see that pattern coming round and round and round. But what is always so startling, and will be startling for us this evening when we get to it, is seeing the call to the prophet to experience the pain that God experiences when he watches his people straying from him. The only way God could communicate to us the pain that he feels is in the intimate relationship of family. It's in this issue of marriage. It's with this business of the relationships between a wife and a husband, parents and their children. Israel is both God's bride and his child. And we'll see that as we work through the text. I often get emails from little devotional emails, and I got one this week that said, God will often put you through trials that have nothing to do with you personally, but are to do with God shaping you so that you can be useful as his servant. They're often to do with helping you to be more compassionate. They're not a discipline, but they are the way that God will simultaneously shape us to be useful in his hands and also reveal his glory. And that certainly seems to be the case here. It's striking. I can't think of a more startling request than the one we're going to see in Hosea. The only one that comes anywhere close in my mind and my heart is the command given to Abraham to take your son, your only son, and sacrifice him in Genesis 22. And for those of us who are a bit more familiar with the text, I think it's just helpful to just stop and just think what it would be like to be an 8th century Israelite. We don't know that much about his exact background, but clearly he's going to be part of the remnant, and clearly he was expecting a normal life with a normal wife and normal children with normal expectations. And yet he's called into this he's called to live out the way, to actually enter into God's pain and to live out live out the life in close quarters. It's really shocking. So, with that said, I think the big kind of the big question I suppose I had was about this section was, what will God do with his adulterous wife? What will God do with his adulterous wife? It's straight off the bat a challenge to us in the way that we live. It's straight off the bat a challenge about discipleship. This is really not this is not an academic exercise for Hosea, and neither should it be for us. So as I read you this first section, do remember that this is a real story about a real person speaking to a real God and being commanded to do something as an act of trusting obedience. It's unrivaled, I think, apart from the story of Abraham in Genesis 22. So Hosea chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, take yourselves an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, "Call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel." Gomer conceived again and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to the house of Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. After she, that's Gomer, had weaned Lo Ruhamah, Gomer conceived another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand of the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. So let's have a look at just a little bit about at these kings. So the first king, King Uzziah. King Uzziah, you can find him in 2 Chronicles 26, the beginning of that section. He built up a massive army, which was very successful, and he expanded the kingdom of Israel quite considerably. So he sounds like a great guy until you get a bit further into chapter 26, when you discover that he usurped the priesthood, because he was a king, so he wasn't a priest, and he thought he could do both. And you'll find that, as I say, you go through chapter 26. And he didn't do a great job at stopping pagan worship. Jotham II in Judah founded a few new towns. You can read about him in 2 Chronicles 27. And then Ahaz is the one you probably know the best, because it was to Ahaz that Isaiah spoke in Isaiah 7. You know, the Lord will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child, and you call him Emmanuel. That is it, that, and that this false, he's the king that kind of pretends that he won't put God to the test. That's the king. You can read about him in 2 Chronicles 28. And Ahaz actually encouraged Baal worship. And then the lovely Hezekiah, 2 Chronicles 29, right the way, I guess, through till 31. This is the king who trusted in the Lord God of Israel like nobody else. He was the great religious reformer. But as you read on into 2 Chronicles chapter 32, and particularly at the end, you'll see that maybe you could almost think that his success was partly his downfall, and certainly isn't that often our experience. And for all his reforms, he couldn't save Judah from itself and from Babylon. And then Jeroboam, he's maybe the last, Jeroboam 2, actually, Jeroboam 2 in 2 Kings 14. He's the last valid kind of king in Samaria. You'll see that he expanded the kingdom, quite successful, but of course did evil in the eyes of the Lord. But these kings give us a quite a narrow range of when Hosea was prophesying, and it was for about 40 years, between like 715 and 750 BC. Right, so he's got a long ministry, 40 years, working between 715 to 750, roughly speaking, years before Jesus was born. So that makes him, I guess, a contemporary of Isaiah. In some ways, they ministered in the same time period with some of the same kings. But it's interesting to me that he's ministering at a time of maybe not a divorce, but certainly a separation that's taken place between northern Israel and southern Israel. You know, that separation, that split has taken place. It's almost as if the failure to love God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and failure to love neighbor as yourself has come into a kind of come into a physical outworking as the great kind of people of God are split in two. And so it's fascinating to me that what God does first is he takes this idea of marriage, and just see that the whole purpose of chapter 1 is revealed in verse 11, verse 10. In the place where it was said to you, "You're not my people, you'll be called sons of the living God." This is I think this is first time you're going to hear this phrase is actually in Hosea. And the people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited. So it seems that Hosea doesn't know about the lost tribes. He's not interested. His long-term view is not of found tribes and lost tribes, but of all Israel united, and united under one leader. And we could skip, couldn't we? I'm desperate to skip almost straight to Romans 9 to 11, and to all Israel being saved under one leader, and to look back at all the prophecies of this coming Messiah who will come and bring. But look back to what we saw in Zechariah, at the end of Zechariah as well. They will appoint one leader, the Messiah, and will come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. What you're going to see throughout this book in so many different ways is that our God is a God of reversal. You often hear people talking about the gospel reversing the curse. Reverse the curse. I guess it's because it rhymes. But right in the beginning of this section, we see that what starts off as judgment ends up in restoration. And it's also interesting. I'm not sure. No one seems to understand why we have four. The message appears to be predominantly to Israel, but the kings that are chosen are predominantly Judah. I think, from my point of view, I think this is a message to all the Israelites, whether they live south of the river or north of the river, as we would make the division in London, or wherever they live, it's to all the people. So let's now look at this, the first section. The context of this situation, actually, of the people, is pretty much prosperity. It's a pretty prosperous sort of time. And the people are in the land of the Canaanites. They're in the land of the Canaanites, and the Canaanites had a pretty well-established religion. It was full of myths and ideas and rituals and rites. And they worshipped a pantheon of gods like the Romans. They they had loads of different gods, and although Baal wasn't the chief god, he wasn't like the head god of the pile, he was the most prominent and maybe the most dominant. He was the god of rain and the giver of fertility. He was the god of rain and the giver of fertility. And he had like all these gods, he had an arch enemy called Moth. And Moth was the god of summer, drought, and death. And so the Canaanites had these two gods, one who was in essentially the giver of life in the rain and of fertility, and one which was the god of drought and death. And they go into battle, and Baal defeats Moth and is therefore worshipped. And the reason I'm taking a bit of time to tell you this is because in Baal religion, he is spoken of as, guess what? The husband of the land. He's the husband of the land. His and the relations with his people are spoken of, and I'm sorry to say this, but there's no way to get around it, in sexual terms. And the temple prostitutes were an integral part of that religious practice. They're a central element of the fertility rituals, which were thought of as the time as a holy act rather than a degrading act. And so the first thing I want to just show you is that it seems as if our God wants to take on these false gods on their own turf. He wants to take on these false gods on their own turf. You will have seen, let's think, does anyone remember the Exodus and the 10 plagues? It's exactly the same kind of idea. That God takes on those God takes on those non-gods and proves them to be powerless against him. Now what God is doing is he's taking on he's going to spiritual war with this false god and doing it in terms that the people can understand. You see, Israel still probably thought of as Yahweh as their national God, but they had maybe given in to the idea of Baal being the local land god, and they had got drawn into a sort of covering both bases type of situation, which ended up being in something called syncretism, where they mixed the two things together. And so Hosea takes on Baal using his own imagery, his own language and his own uses, and he uses it as a sword to pierce the hearts of his people. He's using this image of the heartbroken husband as a sword to pierce the hearts of his people. Much like, this says in Hebrews 4 that the word of God is a sword that pierces. Because what the big difference was, the Baal worshippers knew God as love, but God wanted to show his people that love and sex belonged within the boundaries of marriage. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go, take yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord." So here comes the first thing that I've got to try and explain to you, which hopefully I will be able to do, and it won't be too disorientating for you. Until I started looking at this myself, I assumed I assumed actually that like many people, that Gomer was at first okay, like she was a normal girl. That's what I assumed. I don't know if that's what you did, but as I began to study it and looked at it, it's not the case, and you'll see why as we work through the text. I mean, it could be. Some people say there are lots of faithful Christians, Bible believing, born again, going to be at Revelation 21 and 22 with us people who think that sort of Gomer was, they married, she was faithful, and then later she became unfaithful, because people struggle with the idea of God sending a prophet to marry a prostitute. We struggle with the idea of God sending a prophet, a moral prophet, to go and marry a prostitute. But in fact, that's exactly what happens in this text. Go and take yourself an adulterous wife. So it must be a wife who is, and in the other translations, you can have stronger description. Go and take a wife of fornications and children of fornications, because the land has committed great fornication, which has led them away from the Lord. The situation is so desperate that God's decision is that he must send a good man to do a very dirty job. Go and marry this woman, because the people have departed from him. The people have departed from him. She is called a fornicator. Yes, that's right. Fornicator and a whore in other translations. And then I think verse 3 is the beginning of something new. So she already had children of fornication. Children. She was, if you like, a working prostitute. She had already fallen. She was already beyond the pale. There's plenty of evidence for this, matching the story of Israel. If you want to go to Ezekiel chapter 16 and 23, that'll fill in a load of the detail for you. But that's my position. We can ask, we can talk about it later. He sleeps with Gomer, and a son is born. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. This child cannot be the same children as before, because they're born within the covenant. They're born within the marriage covenant, not. So they're not children of unfaithfulness. They're the exact opposite. They're children of faithfulness, because they're born within the covenant. They're born to Gomer and his wife, Gomer and to Hosea. And notice also that the parents didn't choose the name of the child. Struck me as I was reading, I was thinking to myself, where else do we see the parents don't get to name the child? I was thinking, oh yeah, Jesus and John the Baptist, those are two, and a few others. Even if you think of Emmanuel, God with us, the titles that the Messiah was given in the book of Isaiah. There's something these are signs, just as Isaiah was telling us about a sign, so are these. The first sign, call him Jezreel. Jezreel, I realize I've taken far too long to get to here, but never mind. Jezreel is a place. It can be translated as God sows, but it's really all about bloodshed. It's the place of Naboth's murder as part of Jezebel's kind of plot in 1 Kings 21. It's where Jehu slew Joram, the king of Israel. and then Jehu's later massacre of all Ahab's followers, friends, and priests in 2 Kings 10. So Jezreel is a place of bloodshed. And that opening child, these children are, they're signs. They're children of the sign, the children of signs. And the first sign that's given to us in this section is that judgment is coming. You see that? I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel. I'll put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day, I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Breaking Israel's bow, that's Israel thought that it was strong enough to survive in its own strength, and it wasn't. That's what breaking the bow means. And this valley of Jezreel was a place where there were many battles. It was a place of huge conflict. So the first child tells us that judgment is coming. That, as we've seen before, that God is fully aware of what's going on. He's not in the dark. He's very much aware of what's happening, and he's holy and righteous and will judge. Gomer conceives again and gave birth to a daughter. So we've had a son, and now we have a daughter. This child will be called Lo Rumah, which means not loved. There is no, you would, until the next name, you think that is a really sad state of affairs, isn't it? A child that is not loved. For I will no longer show the love to the house of Israel that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show to the house of Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or horse or horseman, but by the Lord their God. We're seeing here in this second sign that judgment it's too late for Israel. Their fate has been sealed by their actions, but it is not yet time for Judah to be judged. But see also that Judah are not saved by their strength, by their sword, battle, or bow, but by the grace and the mercy of God. And then in verse 8, after she had weaned Lo Rumah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said, call him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. This is the most shocking. This is the most shocking of the three, I think. In a sense, they build because we've had a child not pitied, a child not loved, but now we've got this statement: you are not my people. This is a severing of all God's covenantal commitments to his people. Their sin appears to be so grave that they need to be shown a sign of a child called Lo Ami, for you are not my people and I am not your God. We're looking at a hopeless situation, aren't we? It would seem. And then look immediately how God responds. His immediate response to that startling statement is to say, yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. Throwing us all the way back to Abraham, after his final test in Genesis 22, God promises him that his descendants will be like, that cannot be counted, like stars in the sky or sand on the seashore. If you've ever been to the Middle East or somewhere out remote and you've seen those starry skies full of so many people, it's just wonderful to see the almost unimaginable number of stars that are up in the sky. though the people have done everything to warrant God in his holy justice, cutting the people off, this is what is said to them. In the place where it is said to you, you're not my people, you'll be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah will be reunited, and they'll be appointed as one leader and come out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. The opening chapter of Hosea shows us God's love for his people, but it also shows us the pain that their rebellion caused him. And we'll be working through this book and seeing this all kind of worked out. I think it would be remiss of me not to take you to Romans 9, just to see how Paul uses these the texts that we've looked at. In Romans 9, verse 24, Paul talks about 22. What if God, in choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for his glory? This first chapter, Paul wants to tell us, is about God's glory being revealed, and about us as objects of his mercy. And Paul takes it a stage further, because he says, even us whom he's called, that would be Jewish believers, but not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. As he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and I will call her my loved one who is not my loved one. And it will happen in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people. They will be called sons of the living God. And then instead of using Hosea, he uses Isaiah and says, though the number of Israelites will be like the sand by the sea, only a remnant will be saved. And the Lord will carry out his sentence with speed and finality. Paul sees these signs and this reversal as a process that involves the gathering of the Gentiles before the final gathering in of all of Israel. And I think it's very reassuring to see his plan repeated again and again, the same again and again in so many different contexts, and see how he takes this picture of bloodshed, Jezreel, and turns it into a picture of victory. And see how the cross is a picture of bloodshed that is turned into a picture of victory. See how he will appoint one leader who will unite all of Israel and all of this new chosen people of God. The gospel for the Jew first, and then for the Gentile, every tongue, tribe, and nation, but first for the Jew, and then for all the other nations. I found it just, I think we're going to find it really encouraging to see this, particularly because it seems to me that there are a number of kind of strong parallels for us between the culture that Hosea is writing to and our own. It's a wealthy culture where we're tempted to live lives that are sort of one foot in the culture, one foot in the church. Hosea's audience were certainly keen on pleasure and being entertained. And the challenge to us was, the challenge that Hosea lays down for us is whether we will trust in this eternal hope that is promised, or whether difficult temporary circumstances will continually overwhelm us and stop us from being able to live the lives that bring glory to God. And I hope that as we walk through this, we'll also just really begin to see the pain that our sin causes God and others, and that we would cry out to him to help us to be better at living lives worthy of the name and the calling that we've received. So I hope that's a reasonable introduction to the beginning of the book. I'd love us to talk a little bit about this business of this Gomer before she got married, because it also brings in this idea of adoption. And again, the idea of adoption is that is the idea that you see in Romans 9-11 of the Jew and Gentile adopted into the family adopted into one family. So I hope that was helpful. It's only the very beginning, slow start, and we'll gradually pick up speed as we get to know the text and the book better and the prophet better. And now I'll throw it open to you.